Hi folks, it's been a while since we used InDesign. And InDesign and Illustrator are very similar, so I didn't go over a lot of the basic tools because they are so similar. But since it's been a while, I'm going to go over some of those things just in case you guys um, need a refresher. So the first thing is to get your window set up, you want to have under View, you're going to want to have set up so that, sorry, under Window, you're going to want to have it set up so that your workspace is the Essentials Classic. That gives you the most options. So you see that it switched the way things looked on my screen here. So it has the most popular tools on the right and the left, okay? So anything that's ever missing from the right that you need, and if you hover, you can see what it says. So this is layers, for example. This is opacity or transparency. So you can hover to find different things, okay? So some of the tools that you will perhaps want would be rulers. So under View, again, anything that has to do with what you're seeing on the screen, the basic function would be under View. So that's where rulers are. So that's where you can drag down guidelines, just like in InDesign. The thing that is different with InDesign is once you drag down a ruler, it stays. In Illustrator, if I were to draw a shape and then grab that shape and move it, it's also moving the guidelines. So you may want to, in Illustrator, go up to your guides and lock your guides. Okay. Another thing is if you want to reset your guides to the 0 point, because sometimes when you're working in Illustrator, say I wanted to move this box down and I wanted to see how tall it was, I might drag, sorry, let me make this box black outline so we can see it. I may want to see how tall this is or move it around or adjust it. So I might put a line down here and then want to bring down my 0 point right to that corner. And then I can see it moves my ruler to measure from 0 at this point, horizontal and vertical. So now I know if I drag another line over, my box is 5 point, I guess it's 5 3/8 almost. So again, this is my 0 point by dragging this corner here anywhere you want. And so to reset it, I can double click and now my 0 point is at the 0 of my actual page. That 0 point situation and the rulers work the same in InDesign and Illustrator and Photoshop. So the difference is in InDesign, your guides automatically lock. In Illustrator, you have to manually lock them. Okay, so then you can go in and you can say to guides and you can clear all the guides as well. So here I have my box. I can hover on the corner to rotate it. I can hold down the Shift key, those basic things that you've been doing with InDesign. The other thing is that you can play with color. So here's my color palette. And in InDesign, I generally work with the swatches. I get more flexibility and more options to work with the swatches in InDesign. But in Illustrator, I pretty much work between the swatches and the color palette. They both provide different options. Up in the hamburger, you can set in both programs, you can set it to be RGB or CMYK. So I tend to like to work in CMYK because it gives me more color values to work in, and I can see I'm adding yellow. It goes from 0 to 100, where when you're working in RGB, it changes. The scale changes according to what you're adjusting. So if I'm adding green, I might be taking away blue, and it's confusing for me. So I just work in CMYK. So you can also pull from the picker, and with all menus, you can expand with the little arrows over in this corner. So the little arrows here expand your box, and the hamburger gives you other options in all of these different boxes. Okay. Anything that's missing that you want to work with on the right hand, you go to Windows and you can go and find that. Say you want to work with info. You can click on info and it will open that box, and then you can hover and see the way that blue line is showing up. So I can keep the box over here if I'm using it, or I can go in here and hover and it drops it in there. And anything that I don't want, that I'm not using, I can go and click and it disappears again. Okay, so some tools that we used in Photoshop, we won't be using right away in Illustrator, if any. So the magic wand tool, that's really a tool to use in Photoshop. We're not going to be using it in Illustrator so much. We're going to be using mostly the pen tool in Illustrator, and things that do geometric work. So the difference between Photoshop, you're really doing working with pixels and photo manipulation, and in Illustrator, it's something that's a vector graphics, and you're going to be using it differently. So even though you have a tool that you might be comfortable with in Photoshop, Photoshop does different things, and Adobe puts a lot of the same tools in different programs, but you want to work in the program that essentially does the better job for the task that you have. Okay, so the pen tool works very much the same in both Illustrator and InDesign, but it really works much better in Illustrator, and I'm not sure why. It just does. And the same thing with type. Type works much better in InDesign than in Illustrator. So if you're going to be doing something with a lot of type, you want to work in InDesign. So you've got a couple different tools here. You've got the scale tool and the rotate tool. So we can go and scale something by dragging and holding down the shift key, or releasing the shift key to make it any proportion we want. You want to definitely make sure you use the shift key if you're dragging a photograph, because you don't want it distorted. So we can rotate and do different things right with the selection tool, but you can also use this tool, the scale tool, and when I double click, it brings up this menu, so I can actually go in and say I want this to be 50%, which will help you if you're taking in a drawing, a CAD drawing from another class, and you need to actually make sure you scale it properly. So you won't want to just wing it. You'll want to use the scale tool and give it a precise measurement. Okay, and then the rotation tool, also you can rotate at 25%. You can be specific about what you want to rotate your shape with. There are some other tools with doing column graphs. So if you're going to ever do a column, you can just experiment and play with that. For right now, don't ever touch this perspective grid tool. We're not going to be working on that in this class. And once you set it, it's hard to undo. You can work with brushes. Brushes in Illustrator can be very advanced, because Illustrator, we're using it with your CAD drawings and to be really specific with vector drawings, but there are people who use Illustrator to really do illustration. They do a lot of free-form illustration, and they will use the pen tool, but they may also take a brush and do all sorts of line work, and there's a whole huge the brush tool just is amazing. And if you're an illustrator, you can actually download different brushes that are independent companies making brushes. And I've worked with an illustrator who just knew exactly which artist made the best brushes, and he would download different brushes. But you can also create your own brushes as well. And that's another area that I'm not going to go into in this class, but if it's something that you enjoy and want to experiment with, then go right ahead. So you can get basic brushes, and then you can add calligraphy brushes, and you can play with bristle brushes, and it'll show you more of those, so you can pick the different ones that you want, and you can also change it from uniform to, depending on the brush, it will create a different emphasis and shape, which all of these are not really doing that because they're so much the basics. So if I go from, here's a different brush style here, and some of them take a little longer to load, so you can see that has a fun feel to it. For some of the work you're doing, if you're not really doing illustration, using the brushes can make your work look amateurish, because if you're not really delving into it and really using them, it's not something that you want to just dabble in, because it could make you look like, you've seen those cheesy videos where people do all these different effects and make things spin in and out, and you're just thinking like, that's kind of choosy. You don't want to be doing that, okay? Sorry about that. So, use them gingerly. Okay, so I'm going to delete that, and what else I want to show you? Oh, layers. We've talked a little about layers, but you add a new layer. You can you can duplicate a layer. You can change the colors in Illustrator, which is very helpful, because when you add a new layer, your lines, your guides, will be the color of that layer. So when you are working on something and you maybe have your layers closed and you're not sure what you're working on necessarily, they're both blue squares, but this one is on the red layer and this is on the blue layer. And that will impact you if you are trying to make something go in front of or in back of something and they're both on the same layer or on separate layers, okay? And then there's the pathfinder tool, which I am going to give these some colors here. Make one green actually. And so if I drag over both of these and go to the pathfinder tool and I click on one of these, you really look at the picture. If I click on this one, it makes it all one shape. Do Command Z. If I click on this one, it takes where they overlap. So where they overlap, it gives me just the leftover. Here, it gives me just where they overlap. And over here, it gives me the individual pieces that look like it's one unit, but if I go to the direct selection tool, they are in effect separate units. Okay?